moving ahead here, I want to introduce our speaker today. Tyrone Martinez-Black is one of our support folks at CASEL. His official title, which sounds really great, is Policy and Practice Specialist for the Collaborating States Initiative, and is one of our TA providers and support folks at CASEL. I'm going to turn it over to Tyrone. He's going to share his screen with you momentarily and tell you a little bit about himself. If anybody has difficulty hearing, please put something in the chat box and we will try to problem solve. So Ty, do you want to take it from here?
Yes, thank you. Welcome everybody. I am thrilled to be invited to this conversation with you, and I am hopeful that we can walk through a great many ideas and resources that should be useful to you. So I will set this up if I can correctly. So to start, I will say a little bit about myself. I am a former classroom teacher of mathematics and science in the middle grades primarily. And from the start of my career in classroom, I was also a professional learning provider with our University of Illinois in Chicago, who were primarily responsible for aiding and assisting our teachers in Chicago with implementation of new mathematics curricula and sound pedagogy for that. So for me, that's a significant grounding in the way that I approach now my work at CASEL, having gone from being a classroom educator to an instructional specialist and a district administrator for curriculum for a school district. I now am at CASEL supporting states and districts in the integration of social emotional learning impact in academic practices, as well as policy implementation guidance and so forth, as my title might suggest. So all that is a little bit of a background to give you an idea of who I am and where I'm coming from. And I will also add that my recent duties have included work with what we call our equity work group, which looks to examine how social emotional learning competencies are situated in the striving for equitable learning environments, particularly culturally relevant practices and so forth. So with all that said, I don't want to talk too much more about myself. I want to again welcome you all and invite you to consider, as I move forward, some presuppositions or some principles that are rooting this work. So to start, we would propose that our role, our responsibility as educators is to indeed foster within our students and each other identities that are well situated within our schools and other learning environments. This academic identity is one that we hope to foster, as it means that learners will be secure in how they kind of operate within our learning settings. Particularly, we would ask within the content areas that there is a sense of disciplinary belonging. So in combination with that school-based identity or that general identity of being a learner, there are very specific ways in which our academic disciplines ask us to kind of adopt mindsets, specific kinds of behaviors, of course, vocabulary and languages that let us know that we are operating within the bounds of the given content area, or as I refer to them as academic disciplines. And so this becomes important, of course, because within schools, students are in a constant state of negotiating with themselves, each other, school personnel, and their communities and cultures of home about where it is they fit and how it is they perform and achieve as representative of belonging to those various groups. And so we know that any given student is carrying with them a number of overlapping and intersecting markers for that identity and that sense of belonging. And so as educators, again, in this conversation about integrating social and emotional learning with academics, academic practices, we would, again, presuppose that our responsibility is to help each and every student feel like they belong to the community of learning that is represented in any given instructional period. So all that said, those terminologies overlap with our framework at CASEL for what we call our 5 core competencies, recognizing that there are a variety of ways in which across the nation, around the world, these competencies, these collections of skills and knowledges are articulated. CASEL organizes the competencies in these 5 domains, and I'm sharing this just as a reminder for some, maybe a good introduction for others, about self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making as the areas we'll want to attend to when we are considering what this looks like in our classrooms, particularly in our academic instructional classrooms. So with that grounding, we want to remind ourselves of exactly why this is important, that there have been hundreds of studies done. We have had past meta-analyses of those studies, including more recent looks at longitudinal effects. And repeatedly, we are able to recognize that investing in social emotional learning for students benefit those children and adults, frankly, in adopting academic performance, social emotional skills, attitudes, and positive social behaviors, while also reducing conduct problems, emotional distress, and other ways of being that might be detrimental to learning. And we also know that teachers value and recognize exactly how important this is. We recognize that principals as well, who in a likewise study, as reported here in the missing piece for teachers, and in a principal administrative survey, recognizing greater than 90% believing that SEL is worth investing in, and that teachers, in fact, can pull it off with professional learning and support. And so the beginnings of this webinar are in response to the question, how does it look? What are we supposed to do to make this, in fact, a seamless practice in our buildings? And so CASEL recommends an approach that includes, you see here, 4 bullets of explicit SEL instruction, which is usually within the parameter of an SEL evidence-based program that we would recommend. We also recommend teacher instructional practices that are something you might see in, for example, the Great Teachers and Leaders 10 Practices document, and I'll share a little bit about that later. And of course, today we're talking about integration with academic curriculum areas. All of that is then complemented by an organizational culture and climate strategy that may involve sets of surveys of students and teachers and so forth about what exactly is the environment in which all of this is taking place. So with that in mind, we'll return to a particular content area, and that is mathematics. So we are here today to talk about integration with all of our academic disciplines, but I will ask that we consider mathematics as a starting point because it is one of the, if not the, content area with which there is a high level of frankly, genuine traumatic effect for a lot of our youth. And it also carries with it that implication that those youth, many of them become educators. And so the idea that delivering mathematics with some sense of social and emotional competencies in mind asks us as educators, as well as young learners, to consider the ways in which mathematics affects our identity, our sense of belonging, our sense of responsible decision making in terms of the problems that we may solve, and so on. And so one place we might begin is at a site called insidemathematics.org. You can use your phones, particularly if you have an iPhone. Androids don't always cooperate, but the website is right there and easy enough to find if you want to use that. At insidemathematics.org, and I will shift to show you some navigation here, is a website that you see has Common Core resources, and social emotional learning and mathematics is a feature of that section. And what you would click on is this integrating social emotional learning and the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics. Now, the reason we begin there.
Tyrone,
yes.
just to interrupt you, we're not seeing that on the screen. I think we're only seeing the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, let me, I think that's because of the way it shares. Okay, so let me escape the PowerPoint. Now you see my
We see the PowerPoint
main
app.
screen. Now, yeah, that's right. And now you see the website, correct?
No.
No, we still do not.
When you share.
Okay, let me do that. I apologize. Oh, now there's an, oh, here we go. Okay. So I have to switch to the, okay. So now you should see the web page.
So, yep, we do.
Okay, apologies for that. Okay, so what you have here at Inside Mathematics is then a suite of resources based on the Common Core. And I have already pre-navigated to the Mathematical Practice Standards section, in which you will see a social emotional learning and mathematics discussion about how to connect the social emotional learning standards with mathematics. This was a project that CASEL embarked upon with the Dana Center at the University of Texas in Austin, a recognized mathematics think tank, and the Noyce Foundation to examine where, in fact, social emotional learning is situated within the mathematics instruction. And so, as you can see, this is a white paper that describes those features. And then in the appendix, as I'm scrolling to, you will see this connecting the standards for mathematical practice and social emotional learning competencies. And what that does is a very straightforward, kind of high-level association of the language within the standards of mathematical practice and the social emotional competencies. So, for example, you see at the top there that starting by explaining themselves the meaning of a problem and looking for entry points to a solution is akin to what we would recognize in self-awareness as recognizing one's own strength. And so if we move on from there, we could look at all of the standards for mathematical practice and their associated competencies. In addition, what we learned as part of that study Can you see my slides now again?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. Then we have kinds of tasks, and these are known as MARS tasks. They are collected on the Inside Mathematics website as well as in other locations. And essentially what they describe is a rich enough mathematical problem that requires some collective intelligence, usually students having to work with one another and verify and confirm some of their thinking. And so it is a little bit more than simply a word problem, which is how sometimes I think they are received. They actually, in their full construction, have guidance around how to extend the mathematics, how to ask questions and push for high cognitive demands, and so forth. And so it's with these types of tasks that we again return to the idea that a student's academic identity and their sense of disciplinary belonging is built with the use of mathematics and mathematics tasks that in fact demand that development. And so this is an important distinction as we try to answer the question, what does this look like in our classrooms, is to start with what in fact does the mathematics in our classrooms look like. And if the mathematics in our classrooms looks like simple, naked, and contextless problem exercises, then there will be little reason to see social emotional learning. However, if we use tasks that actively call upon students to assess themselves, to monitor their own progress, to collectively work with others in constructing arguments and so forth, those are the types of instructional experiences that would demand some attention to social and emotional competence on the part of the learner as well as the educator. And so we ask, again, starting with mathematics, but what are we aiming for in all of our content areas? Each of our disciplines, whether we're talking about mathematics, language arts, art, civics, even physical education and health, they all look very different from a, I won't quite say a superficial level, but they are organized as they are around, again, the disciplinary community that has formed around them. And so when we talk about academic integration, it is surely a question at many academic sites, schools, and after school programs and so forth is, well, if it looks like something in math, will it also look like that in English language arts? And so we might begin with a kind of framework, starting with this idea that the standards for mathematical practice and social emotional learning competencies have some alignment. We might begin to look for patterns of language that synchronize with the core competencies in any of our standards. And so that might mean taking a look at our standards for social studies, for example, or our standards for art, or our standards for science, and see how indeed they have transferable processes, habits of mind, and ways of behaving that speak to the social and emotional competencies. So this is an example of what one might do to develop a competency-based alignment. And so this is just taking social emotional learning and the content area, or the domain rather, of self-awareness. And those 5 on the left-hand side include our indicators from CASEL about what self-awareness might include. And of course, those are just simple phrases and do not speak fully to the depth of what's underneath that. So identifying emotions, for example, is not simply being able to name that I am angry or happy or what have you, but rather all of the kind of physiological recognition of what feelings actually feel like, recognizing what triggers those emotions in me and others and so forth. And so we move to the column that is mathematics, And I've simply identified a handful of places where those indicators might come to play. So in mathematics classrooms, for example, problems can be very frustrating. And for students who are engaged in those problems, or in schools where they are generally frustrated, the capacity to attend their cognition on learning mathematics is particularly troublesome. They might also need to identify as a mathematician or recognize that they are within school and learning as reflected as a representation of themselves, their home community, their culture, their gender. All of those things come into play as they are thinking about how they fit within the mathematics community. And then they might indeed value the repeated reasoning as articulated in the standards for mathematical practice. They might leverage their knowledge of prior problems. They might focus on how they have accumulated skills and postures toward past problems and use that to build their confidence and their sense of self-efficacy. If we move further right into thinking about general academic disciplines, we might learn from what we studied with the Dana Center and recognize that rich tasks that are accessible yet cognitively demanding present an opportunity to see this in action. So that might be beyond mathematics in English and language arts, for example, that not simply reading a text, but also trying to construct the social significance of a given text in time or in culture, or what it means that a person might interpret it differently than others and so forth. That welcoming a process of identity formation within the community of learning or honoring identities that are formed outside of those settings is a part of mathematics learning. And so we might recognize that mathematics and its instruction leads to kinds of outcomes for sets of people within our school and in our communities differently than others. And so the reason that we are even attending to social and emotional learning is as a possible complement or an enhancing of our instructional practice, which again is meant to bring students into a sense of academic identity and a disciplinary belonging so that they can thrive and progress in schools and beyond. And so helping them or recognizing that they are navigating that identity and making that a part of instructional practice is a sound strategy. And then we also want to consider organizing around abundance and accumulation of skill rather than deficits. So that can take place in mathematics, certainly, where we must take great care that our mathematics instruction is not used as a sorting mechanism that concentrates on how effective, or rather how ineffective a given student might be, but rather with developmental cognition in mind, recognizing that they have accumulated prior knowledge and skill that they can apply to greater and greater access to the mathematics community. And so with that in mind, these should sound familiar to those who have looked at teaching the whole child that comes from the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders. And embedded in that document, which you can find at that link or using that QR code, 10 signature practices that really should translate and transfer across disciplines. And so I would concentrate, starting with these first 6, in the student-centered discipline and teacher language. Those are where we are asking students to act as mathematical. We would use our language to ask questions like, how indeed are you as a student, or me as an educator, how are we fulfilling our standards of mathematical practice, for example. We might ask, after having shared very specifically the standards or the competencies we're trying to develop within our discipline, how are we fulfilling that, and what does it look like? So when we look at student-centered discipline, there's a construction of ways of being and behaving that are supportive of our belonging to a community together in this academic area. Looking at responsibility of choice and want and support, those are complementary in that we would be looking for ways in which students have an obligation to co-construct their ways of learning, as well as welcoming them into this community in our classroom and the larger, broader community that is mathematics exploration. And so as an example of practice, we might say that for responsibility and choice, for example, youth participatory action research, which asks students to kind of engage more in their community, is a way for them to demonstrate their responsibility and their choices. This is a recommendation that comes from our recent release of a brief on social emotional learning and equity, or cultural analysis by Robert Jiggers, Deborah G. Rivas-Drake, and Teresa Borowski, is featured on our Measuring SEL website about assessment. And so that is, again, a practice. The warmth and support might incorporate ideas of our morning routines, like circles, in which we ask for students how they're feeling and what they're going through, even within mathematics classrooms. Again, using that only as an example, it can be social studies or any other subject. We might, in fact, pose to students an opportunity to say how they are feeling about the content and ingesting that content and adopting that content as days go by. And so it might be a daily, it might be a weekly exercise to simply gather and ask directly, how are students managing through their learning in the subject area. In looking at cooperative learning in classroom discussions, many, of course, are familiar with group work and collaborative projects. And so the idea that we would use tasks like those Mars tasks I showed earlier to provoke cooperation and collective learning, to provoke needs for discussions as people approach problems in different ways and try to understand where other students are coming from. There's a kind of perspective taking that we highlight in our social awareness competency, for example. In addition, we have self-reflection and self-assessment and balanced instruction, which ask for students to genuinely monitor themselves, and that is also one of our competencies in self-awareness and self-management. And that balanced instruction gives an opportunity to modulate between an active learning or a kind of direct instruction between individual versus cooperative settings. And then with academic present expectations, that is a high level of belief that every student, in fact, can succeed and achieve some mathematics learning. And so we model for our students, in particular, again, returning to why we start with mathematics as an example, is this is a particularly challenging skill, number 10, when one is not necessarily confident of their own disciplinary belonging. If a teacher is out there, or even administrators and so forth, who believe that they are not necessarily mathematically strong, then conveying that possibility to students can be challenging. And so this particular skill is worth a great deal of attention when we are trying to integrate social and emotional learning practices into our classrooms, because we have to believe that we are capable of learning that much more mathematics or science or social studies as necessary to support students as they work toward belonging to that disciplinary community. And so there are opportunities here to be open and vulnerable and genuinely kind of open to our students in revealing that we are learning also, that we are not only highly successful in the past for what we've learned, but capable of encountering failures and feedbacks and general ways of kind of continuous learning that we hope they will come to adopt as a posture as well. So I will take a genuine pause there for a moment and ask if there are indeed any questions with what we've gone through so far. It's been quite a bit.
Feel free to put stuff in the chat box if you'd like.
I'm sorry?
I was just asking people to put questions in the chat box if they'd like.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
It looks like you could probably keep going.
Okay, wonderful. So at this point, as I said, that is a lot to kind of process as simply a disposition. This is all that I've shared so far is really about taking an opportunity to consider what is our posture toward this idea of integration of social emotional learning into our academic practices. Right now, I want to move us into some resources that might serve as starting places for building a kind of practice that incorporates any or all of the ideas we've shared so far.
And Tyrone, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second.
Certainly.
My guess is we've got a number of attendees here who were able to attend our day one SEL trainings somewhere around the state. And if you recall, we talked about establishing a shared vision and mission. And when Tyrone says that this is about a disposition, we're talking about the why. We spent some time and we watched Simon Sinek talk about the power of why. We challenged you to look at your own vision and missions for your schools and your school districts about why you exist and why you are doing what you're doing. And this is a great intersection with that philosophical underpinning of where do we really truly believe that SEL fits in our school climate. Sorry to interrupt, Tyrone, but I just wanted to try and make clear the connection between what you're talking about and what some of these folks have already experienced.
No need for any apologies. That I really appreciate that grounding because it's in fact a modeling of additional ways that we approach this work, which is again that there must be in fact explicit connections. One of the signature practices of quality instruction of any sort at any level is to be sure that people understand how we are aimed, how we are threading ideas and skills and knowledges together. And so I definitely appreciate that reference to the why and to trying to establish a vision and mission, which is also at Castle one of our theories of action for districts and schools. And I'll actually come to that, use that as a segue to go into our first resource.
We do have one question.
Oh, wonderful.
Ashley asked if you could use the teaching practices to develop a coaching plan with the teacher.
If I could, or if one could.
If one could.
Yes, indeed. So If you would please restate that question, because I want to make sure I answered it appropriately.
She asked if you could use, if the teaching practices would be a tool to use to develop a coaching plan with the teacher.
Yes. So one of the, I would say, recommended strategies, or a possible strategy that's actually articulated in this Teaching the Whole Child report, is there, in addition to these practices and an articulation of the importance of social emotional learning, it goes on to describe how components of assessment, components of teacher evaluation, components of ongoing continuous learning, professional learning community, and so forth might point to these 10 as a means of kind of centering and grounding any professional learning work. So that might include coaching, that might include even the development of professional learning sessions where those who are providing said professional learning might ask themselves which of the 10 or combinations of them they are activating by providing their learning. So I think that's a really important question, and it speaks to, in some ways, a kind of meta cognition about preparing ourselves and our colleagues in the classroom for engaging in this work.
And Tyrone, I really appreciate that answer. Here in Wisconsin, we have an evaluation system for pupil service folks and for educators and administrators that has in place a professional practice goal. And these types of practices seem to be something that would lend themselves really well towards targeting for improvement on a professional practice goal, whether you're a school counselor or a school social worker, working with students in large groups, or whether you're a science teacher or whether you're a principal. So I really do appreciate that reference.
Thank you for that. I think this is a wonderful way to engage in this discussion, this dialogue, because I would offer as a complement to that, we recognize at Castle that one of the significant features, or factors rather, that we would attend to in helping foster social and emotional development for our children in our schools and other learning environments is that adults themselves need strengthening and support of their social and emotional competencies, as well as developing skills for teaching social and emotional competencies. And so those two aspects of the adult learning go hand in hand. And when you describe mechanisms or systems for examining one's own practice, then educators, our colleagues in the classrooms, of course, must feel safe. They must feel like they belong to a thriving learning community that is asking them to be sometimes experimental, sometimes daring, sometimes willing to make the kinds of mistakes that we know learning involves. And so to full circle return to the question about building a coaching strategy, then that is the posture in which we might situate ourselves as learning specialists, as coaches, and other educator support that says to our colleagues in the classroom, this is why we, and I'm going to use it very deliberately, why we care about you and what you're doing for our children and our youth in schools. And so as a demonstration of that care, as a demonstration of the ways we believe in your competence, your confidence, and your kind of character as an educator, we would embark upon this coaching model together collaboratively so that we can all, in fact, improve and learn in our education system. So it's really exciting to hear this exchange. So I thank you for continuing to lift up the ways you're approaching it in Wisconsin as direct examples of actually fulfilling these principles that we're describing. If there are no other questions or points, we will move on. Yeah.
Please continue.
Okay, thank you. So this is, okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so as I said, this idea that was queued up in this dialogue we just had about developing a vision, developing a mission, preparing a strategy, and kind of aligning resources and implementing a systemic SEL, we at CASEL, in our work with districts and other learning communities, after school providers and so forth, we offer that this district framework gives a grounding for how to approach social emotional learning in a systemic way. And so if I can, I will go through a navigation. I want to make sure that we can see what I'm showing you. You can all see my web browser now, correct?
Yep, you just switched to a Common Core state standard for math practice.
Wonderful. So what I need to navigate beyond this button is in my way. Okay. All right. So here we have the District Resource Center. And when one navigates to this website, it is meant first and foremost to provide resources and ways of orienting a school district to systemic implementation of social emotional learning. What I would point you to right now, if you see my cursor, is hovering over the district framework. That gives us the categories or the components of what we have worked with districts to identify as a process for systemic SEL. And you will see here that integration is among those elements. Each of the elements on the website provides an overview that describes what it means. And then I will point you to this process tab that shows us how to integrate SEL with a variety of district initiatives. And that does not just include academics. It can be our MTSS, our PBIS, trauma-informed care, and so forth. Any priority that we've identified in our district. And so in this particular instance, we are going to look at examples of SEL integration and instructional practices, which will give complementary general instruction practices that resonate with the great teachers and leaders work that we've already been talking about, as well as some district-specific, across the nation examples of integrating SEL into specific academic content areas. So I wanted to provide that for you as a kind of resource. In addition, we have recently launched, it's very exciting, a school guide for school-wide social emotional learning. This is brand new, just released from beta this month. And if you go to that website, here is its launch page. And what you will see upon first arrival is another dialog box that announces that we are just launching this, and we are very excited about it because it outlines in a similar way to the District Resource Center key areas of attention, focus areas, if you will, about organizing for social emotional learning in schools, implementing, and continuous improvement. And so I will highlight our focus area 3, which is promoting SEL for students. And here you will find a framework for introducing the core competencies into classroom activities and other areas of student life, some of the importance of social emotional learning, and using evidence-based programs to support students in SEL. I would then have you navigate to the classroom, where you will see very specific essential areas for implementation that include a supportive classroom environment, integration of SEL practices with daily instruction, and explicit SEL instruction, which complement the slide I showed you very early in this conversation. And so here we have the integration of SEL and instruction. Clicking on that gives us 3 areas to attend to, 3 interdependent components, if you will, for looking at mindsets in academics, aligning specifically SEL and academic objectives, and using interactive pedagogy. And so with mindsets, objectives, and pedagogy, those 3 components combine to give us an example of how we might integrate SEL into daily instruction and other classroom practices. And so that is, I was about to say simply, although it is very rich. There's a lot to consider. And of course, we at Castle welcome any contact or communication, any outreach around this work. I've spoken with Beth about the extension of questions. Certainly, if people are willing to send them to Beth and other within your state, they can be kind of collected and forwarded to me or other colleagues here at Castle for us to try to address. And so with that, I would say, again, I recognize it was a lot of material and we did go through relatively quickly. If there are still any lingering questions or you would like me to revisit any of the components, I will gladly do so.
So any more questions for Ty? So I am going to share something with you all. Can you all see the slide that I just put up?
I can see it.
Thank you. Okay.
So can I, yep.
Okay. So this will be included in your PowerPoint to show you a little bit about some visual examples of what that might look like for integration. But there's a dedicated high school class and what it could look like an advisory for high school. And neither of those are national examples. The academic integration at middle school is from Waukesha. And then I'd like to share with you a little bit with this PowerPoint that we've also linked to. It's a Google Doc that we've linked to. We had a great conference in December where we had 2 high school teachers share how they integrated into academics. And some of the things that Tyrone was talking about, for example, with high school, and just some things that the high school teacher shared that she does. She does do 9th grade algebra teacher, and she does class meetings once a week. She was going to increase those. She indicated that she felt her colleagues were concerned that she was not going to get all of the academic content in, and she found out she was actually keeping up with everybody or doing a little bit better. So these are some other resources for you to see exactly what that might look like. This slide will be connected to the PowerPoint that Tyrone is sharing with us, and those will be posted with the recording. The other thing we'd like you to know is that when Ty was showing you the school guide, that is the same school guide that Greg and I have been working with teams on throughout the state for implementation. And we will also be hosting 2 more day 1 trainings for teams around that, looking at the first 2 pieces of the theory of action. And then we'll be setting up some day 2 trainings as well. So like to open this up for any more questions, and I'm trying to see where my chat box went.
I'm on the chat box. There's no, actually, when do you anticipate stuff being posted? This fantastic information. Folks would like to get it to their decision makers, different teams, that kind of thing.
What we have to do is put our recording to folks upstairs. We call it upstairs here at DPI. It has to be closed captioned in order to meet requirements to go on the web. So once it's closed captioned, we will put it online. So that just depends on when our closed captioning folks can get to it.
And Ty, question for you from one of our attendees here. The specific example you gave started with mathematics and the integration of mathematics common core standards and what could be extrapolated into SEL. Just from your experience in working with districts around and schools and states all over the country, do you think there's an idea that starting with maybe one subject area is a strategy to use to help folks be less overwhelmed with this idea? Wisconsin, we're pretty radically known for initiative fatigue right now. There's a lot of stuff going on. So just would love to hear your ideas.
Certainly. So I can essentially share the story of how we are often, and I will say myself specifically, am received in conversations about integration with academics. And so oftentimes people will express with some ease that social and emotional learning looks very readily available in English language arts. Secondarily to that, they will say social studies is a very easy place to see social emotional learning. And one of the reasons that they make that contention is because looking at others, in the case of stories that might be characters, or even in nonfiction at actors in history and so forth, hence the social studies connection, is a way for people, learners, to look at others, right? To see the perspectives, to express some empathy for other beings. And so we then write about that in language arts. We then listen to others. We then read. We then talk. You know, all of those kind of aspects, those dynamics of classroom and social belonging seem readily activated. What often gets posed, however, is that because in mathematics, certainly, science also, educators of those subjects, particularly as they advance into higher and higher degrees of difficulty and grade levels, they often express that they do not have room because their concentration on skill development, specifically belonging to the disciplinary area, takes up so much time and energy. And so considering feelings or considering emotions doesn't seem as natural. And so by starting with a single subject, as the question is asking, and I would certainly recommend math or science, is because that is challenging, it activates two things simultaneously. One, a resolution to the possibility of integration. So just by paying attention to it, you're going to give people tools and strategies for doing so. But also by forcing everyone present, in a sense, to acknowledge that this difficult conversation of how SEL fits in mathematics, for example, is one of the reasons we, even as adults, need the competencies. And so it is a challenging context. And because of that, we would be able to illuminate, indeed, the ways we ourselves as adult learners are approaching that, and then might have empathy for how our young learners are approaching it as well. And so I hope that is helpful in that answering that question, is that you do see an ease of entry by concentrating on a single subject. And yet I would also recommend using a subject like math or science where people don't immediately recognize the integration as a very useful way of cultivating a community of learning in the schools or district-wide.
Great, thank you.
And I just wanted to share with you that the PowerPoint that I shared with you with the 9th grade algebra examples is from Megan Willauer from Madison East High School, and she's joined us on the webinar. She's we're really short of time, but I want to point out to you that if you want to contact her, her contact information is in that slide, or in that power slide deck that we're sharing with you. And she can share with you a lot of the different thought that went behind how she's constructing so many different pieces of the room. With an hour PowerPoint or an hour webinar, it's pretty difficult to get to all the details and the nuances, and she's very open to talking with you if you have more detailed questions. I think she might also be a really good person to connect. We've got a question from Mary from Sheboygan Falls, because a number of the things that Megan is doing are aligned with UDL. And so I know that you may be looking at different grade levels than 9th grade perhaps, but she has found a really nice way to integrate so much of that into the classroom, making it just part of the culture of what kids experience, and being exactly what Ty was saying, being learners in maths, identifying as being mathematicians, 9th grade mathematicians. Any other questions before we wrap here? I'm so glad you could all join us, and this was an excellent webinar. And Tyrone, thank you so much for sharing your experience at this and talking to so many different districts across the nation to develop the recommendations and the ideas, and the resources that CASEL is able to provide are just really incredibly useful to us. So thank you so much.
Well, I thank you for the invitation to participate with your learning community in this way. As I hope it is evident, this is a very kind of impassioned subject for me. I believe very deeply in the essential social and emotional quality of education, and in particular, those subjects where we don't always see it as evident. And so this opportunity to explore with you all the possibility of really examining our practice from a social emotional lens. I am just grateful to you all for joining this call and the ongoing work that you all do in service of our children. So I appreciate you as well.
Thank you. So thank you everybody for joining us. We are going to land this plane at pretty much exactly 1 o'clock. And as we said, the recording and the PowerPoints will be available to you as soon as we're able to get everything closed captioned and up on the web. Please note that we do have another webinar next month, and feel free to join us for that. And we hope to have some information soon about our SEL conference, now called Symposium, that will be occurring in June of this year. So stay tuned for all that information as well. Thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.